Welcome to Meymandi Concert Hall for this evening's Meredith College Lillian Parker Wallace lecture. Please silence all electronic devices. No audio or video recording is permitted. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Good evening. I'm Ann Bryan, Meredith class of 71, and on behalf thank you. On behalf of the Wallace Lecture Committee and all those involved in planning this event, a warm welcome to the Lillian Parker Wallace Lecture. To all in this hall and to those joining us via a live stream in Jones Auditorium on Meredith's campus, as well as around the country and around the world, we are delighted to have you with us for this very special occasion in the life of Meredith College. We continue a tradition tonight through the Wallace Endowment and Lecture Series of bringing speakers of singular achievement, recognized far and wide for their insight and impact, offering students and the wider community an academically significant and enriching and memorable experience. The list of speakers in our series, which is detailed in your program, includes 5 Nobel Peace Prize recipients, 2 former heads of state, and the first woman to be Justice of the Supreme Court. Dr. Lillian Parker Wallace was one of the pantheon of great professors who brought excellence in teaching and set high expectations for their students during my class's college years. Dr. Wallace, a beloved professor who certainly exemplified these characteristics, chaired the history department for many years and was a Renaissance woman, a woman of many talents and interests, from author, musician, and artist to athlete and community leader. Dr. Wallace, several of whose family members are with us tonight, was tiny in stature but big in impact. My class knew her for her occasional 5 o'clock Monday afternoon freshman history lectures in the auditorium, where she held us in rapt attention. What a feat that was. Our admiration turned to affection that freshman spring when she became the White Rabbit, as she had since 1924 in the quadrennial faculty production of Alice in Wonderland. When it came time for my class to make our senior gift to the college, we were quite pleased to name in her honor the gift that was to become this lecture series. As we viewed it, our gift embodied the quest for knowledge, the appreciation of excellence in its pursuit, and the acceptance of the responsibility of each individual to contribute to the world around her that Meredith had inspired in us. Our commitment was not just to that senior gift, but was to continue to support the endowment and lecture through our gifts as alumni, and that's what we've done. Here we are 48 years later, in the midst of a 5-year pledge to take the endowment to even greater heights as we pass the $1 million mark in the endowment's principal by our 50th reunion. I believe Dr. Wallace would be thrilled that the Wallace Lecture has brought this particular speaker here tonight. The broadening of women's roles and opportunities in the world over the past few decades would be deeply satisfying to one who did much to prepare young women at Meredith for myriad contributions in our community and in our world. I once asked one of her family members, herself a Meredith graduate, what Dr. Wallace would have expected to be the result of this change in the status of women. Her quick reply was, "Greater peace and better behavior." Each time we gather for a Wallace lecture, we celebrate anew the ability of individuals to make a difference as we hear and learn from voices that have made extraordinary marks on our world. Our speakers leave an indelible impression, inspire us on our own journeys, and challenge us to continue to seek our own ways of making a mark. Tonight will be no exception. Now, as every class rightfully does, my classmates here tonight think our class is pretty special, and we treasure our Meredith experiences for preparing us to go strong in our homes, in our careers, and in our communities. We have many examples of following our dreams to results that may well have been beyond our imagination at the time, knowing now that aiming high is always the right course. One such example from our class will take the stage to talk with Justice Ginsburg tonight. Suzanne Reynolds, Meredith class of 71. In September 1967, our freshman class arrived at Meredith, and Suzanne and I moved in right across the hall from each other on 3rd Stringfield. We and our suite mates were friends from day one, and we cherish those friendships to this day. Suzanne is possibly the most serious student I have ever known. We all marveled at the long hours she spent in the library, but she was always a lot of fun too. She was the consummate English major. Her love of the English language and literature was plain to see. I still remember that for the birth announcement of her firstborn, a few years after we graduated, she quoted William Wordsworth's Ode on Imitations of Immortality. Her mentor, Dr. Meredith Lynch Johnson, must have been so proud. I thought Suzanne would be an English professor, but she had other dreams and followed them into law to make her mark. You can read about her distinguished career in your program. Tonight, no doubt, she'll be calling on her skills in both language and law as she converses with Justice Ginsburg. Before that conversation begins, though, please join me in welcoming Meredith's president, Dr. Joe Allen, who will make a special presentation and introduce our speaker.
Thank you all very much. As president of Meredith College, I'm delighted to welcome you. Among our guests tonight are far too many dignitaries to recognize, but please know how much we appreciate you and your love for Meredith College. I'm especially proud to welcome our students, faculty, staff, trustees, alumni, and others who make up the powerhouse that is Meredith College. In addition, I offer special thanks to our behind-the-scenes staff and volunteers, ranging from caterers to security to event planners and ticket distributors, most of whom have asked to remain anonymous. If you think the U.S. Marshals are below the radar, you should consider those with keys to tonight's tickets. Finally, with us, but not among us, are friends in Raleigh and around the world. Our students in Meredith's Palazzo in Tuscany, Italy, our Meredith travelers on their excursion to Scotland, and even an alumna in Dubai who are tuning in to our live cast of this event. Hello, friends. I'd like to especially recognize the class of 1971 and members of the Lillian Wallace Committee, whose imagination and dedication have sparked almost 50 years of inspirational speakers as guests of Meredith College. Ann Bryan relayed the history of this event and Dr. Wallace's impact. At this time, however, I'd like to make a special tribute to those whose support has been invaluable. Shortly before her death in 1971, Dr. Wallace painted a special work, likely one of, if not the last, work of her life. The painting resided with former academic dean at Meredith, Alan Burris, whose recent death led his family to return the work to the college. Jean, Dr. Jackson, if you would please unveil the work as it's being rededicated with the statement on the back of the piece that says, painted by Dr. Lillian Parker Wallace a few days before her death on May 31st, 1971, expressly to honor the Meredith College class of 1971 for their establishment of the endowment to support the Lillian Parker Wallace Visiting Professorship. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I should tell you that one of those anonymous behind-the-scenes persons that has worked like crazy for this event just left the stage. Tonight, it's my great privilege to introduce Justice Ginsburg and to honor her as an outstanding woman of achievement. For 13 years, Meredith has given this award to extraordinary women who've made significant contributions to their fields. Through our Woman of Achievement Award, we recognize the many ways that women in our midst show courage, compassion, and dedication to humankind. As a women's college, Meredith has been breaking down barriers for women since the college was established 128 years ago. Tonight's honoree has dedicated her extraordinary career to doing the same, and I can think of no one better suited to receive this award. An iconic figure, Justice Ginsburg needs little introduction, but I would like to share just a few highlights from her numerous accomplishments that directly relate to her lifelong work to advance the rights of women, and in that fashion, to advance the rights of all. She received her BA from Cornell University, attended Harvard Law School, and received her LLB from Columbia Law School. When she entered Harvard Law School, she was one of 9 women in a class of 500. Justice Ginsburg held seats on both the Harvard and Columbia Law Reviews. She went on to become a professor of law at Rutgers University School of Law and the first female tenured professor at Columbia Law School. She was co-founder of the Women's Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, and she also co-founded the Women's Rights Law Reporter, the first law journal in the United States devoted to gender equality issues. She argued a series of historic cases before the Supreme Court, establishing the equal citizenship rights of men and women. In 1993, she was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Bill Clinton, becoming the second woman to serve on the Supreme Court. Please join me now in congratulating Meredith College's Woman of Achievement, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Thank you so much, everyone. Please be seated.
Justice Ginsburg, I want to borrow a joke from Marty Ginsberg to start. In light of that kind of rousing reception, I bet you didn't know there was a convention of retired law deans in Raleigh tonight. Will you share the real joke?
We were attending theater in New York. It was days after the court handed down its decision in Bush v. Gore. And when I entered the theater after intermission, everyone stood up to applaud. And Marty said to me, I bet you didn't know there's a tax lawyers convention in town.
I want to start, Justice Ginsburg, with one of your favorite topics, Cecilia Reeder Bader. I believe you said in the Rose Garden, after Bill Clinton had announced that you would be his very first appointment, that you owed most to her. What lessons did she teach you that you thought were the most important for your ending up on the Supreme Court?
One of my happiest memories of my childhood is sitting on my mother's lap while she read to me. She was a voracious reader. She would take me to the library every Friday afternoon and leave me in the children's section while she had her hair done. and then I would choose 5 books, and then we'd return them the following week. The 2 lessons that she stressed more than anything else, as I told the Meredith students earlier today. One was be independent, and the other was be a lady. And being independent meant it would be fine if you met and married Prince Charming. But whether you do or not, always be ready to fend for yourself. And her other message was be a lady, which meant don't lose time on emotions that will not get you any place. So don't waste time on anger, on resentment, on jealousy. A lady doesn't let those emotions interfere with her life. Just do things that will help you move forward.
Do you think she could have imagined where your career would take you?
I think not in her wildest dreams. She was very high on a good education, but she thought that a good job for me would be a high school history teacher, because teaching was an occupation open to women at a time when many doors were closed. The law school I attended, I started in 1956. It didn't admit women until 1950. The Harvard Business School didn't admit women until the mid-60s. There were so many things off limits to women. So I've sometimes tell a joke that is told in many versions. And my version is, what is the difference between a bookkeeper in New York's Garment District, my mother was, and a Supreme Court justice? And my answer is 1 generation. And that's why I am such an optimist, because as bleak as things may seem, I have seen so many changes in my lifetime. Opportunities open for people of whatever race, religion, and finally gender.
Your mother died just as you were graduating from high school. Did she participate in the decision for you to attend Cornell?
Her brother, her eldest brother, who was the only one in the family who had a college education, had gone to Cornell. My mother graduated from high school when she was 15 and went immediately to work because the family needed her income. So Cornell was always a school that I thought would be a great place.
We, as Meredith alumni, were just wondering if you considered one of the 7 sister schools, one single-sex
Well,
education.
I considered one, certainly, Wellesley. I also applied to Barnard College, but Cornell had an irresistible opportunity for me. In those days, if you got the New York State scholarship and you attended Cornell, you got, in addition, a Cornell scholarship. So that took care of all of my tuition and most of room and board. So that was an opportunity one couldn't turn down.
Right.
And then another thing about Cornell, in those ancient days, the ratio was 4 men to every woman. It was a favorite place for parents to send their daughters. The idea was, if you couldn't find a man at Cornell, you were hopeless. And I never questioned that ratio. Of course, the women on the whole were a lot smarter than the men. Till I went to law school. Cornell's excuse for the ratio was the men don't have to live on campus. They don't have to live in a dormitory. They can live in college town. But the women need to be protected, so there must be dorm space for them. I get to the Harvard Law School. There's no room in the dorm for women. The dorm is reserved for men. And the women have to find a place in town, which for me I would have done anyway, because by then I was married and had a child.
I think you had no repeat dates your first semester at
Yes.
Cornell.
Well, I had a boyfriend at Columbia Law School, and I decided, well, there were so many of them out there, I would never date the same person twice.
And I've heard you say, I think you say it in the documentary, that Marty Ginsberg was the first boy who appreciated that you had a brain.
Who cared that I had a brain?
Who cared that you
Yeah.
had a brain. How do you account for Marty's feminism in the 40s?
Marty was so secure in what he was that he never thought of me as any kind of a competitor. In fact, a classmate of mine at Cornell said, you know, you're so lucky because Marty is so satisfied with himself that he thinks you have to be spectacular if he wants to spend his life with you. Well, that's the way he was. He was always my biggest booster.
Yes. I want to ask you about your long hours. I think you developed your work ethic and your ability to pull all-nighter after all-nighter while you and Marty were in law school. Of course, you had Jane, was 3 years old, and Marty was sick.
Yes, Marty was diagnosed with a virulent cancer his third year in law school. So he spent weeks in the hospital and then 6 weeks of daily radiation. In those days, there was no chemotherapy, and there was only massive radiation. So my life was I attended school in the morning, went to Mass General when he was in the hospital in the afternoon, and then came home, took care of Jane, my daughter. And when all that was done, then I went back to the books. So I was living on about 2 hours of sleep a night. Once he came home, I had arranged for classmates of his to take notes in all of his classes. And many of them came first to the hospital, then at home, and they had tutorials for him. He attended only 2 weeks of classes that final semester, and he got the highest grades that he had ever gotten because he had the best teachers, his classmates.
Wow.
He would also, to graduate, you needed to write a senior paper. So he would come home from the radiation, go to sleep, get up about midnight, and whatever he ingested during the day was in those hours from midnight till he finished dictating the segment of his paper. He'd go back to sleep about 2 o'clock, and then I went back to my books to prepare for the next day. But we never, even though we knew the chances of his survival were not great, we never thought about the possibility of not being together. So people ask me, why did you leave Harvard after 2 years and go to Columbia? One reason was we didn't know how long he would live, and the other was I didn't want to be a single mom. And Jane was then 3 years old, so we decided to stay together as a family.
And I believe that you can still keep those long hours. Can't you do on 2 hours sleep every now and then?
Every now and then it becomes, I'm 86 years old now, so it's not as easy as it used to be. And
It's impossible
I
for
live in
me.
deadly fear of falling asleep on the bench. So in the days when Justice Souter sat next to me, he would watch me, and every now and then he would give me a gentle shove.
You said a few minutes ago that your mother told you to be a lady and not resent things, that those kind of sentiments didn't get you anywhere. You had lots of opportunities to be resentful. One was in law school when the dean asked you and the other 8 women who were there, why were you taking a seat when a man could have held that seat?
Yes, the dean had a dinner for all the women in the entering class. So for my class, it was 9, a big jump from Marty's class. He was a year ahead of me. There were only 5 women in his class. When the numbers increased to 20, the dean said enough, and he didn't continue those dinners. But after dinner, which was not distinguished, and there was no wine because he was a teetotaler, he sat us around in a semicircle and asked each of us in turn to say what we were doing at the law school, occupying a place that could be held by a man. Well, one of my classmates gave the dean the perfect answer. She said, Dean Griswold, there are over 500 of them, and only 9 of us. Well, really only 8 because Ruth Ginsburg doesn't count for this purpose. what better place to find a man? So but the dean was not known for his sense of humor. And years later, he told me why he asked that question. And he said there were still members of the Harvard Law School faculty who doubted the wisdom of admitting women to the law school. So he wanted to be armed with stories from the women themselves about what they would do with their Harvard Law School degree.
And then when you graduated from Columbia Law School, you couldn't find a job with a law firm, and I believe one of your Columbia law professors had to talk a judge into hiring you. Still not resentful?
I was enormously pleased that I had that opportunity. For the women of my generation, the big challenge was to get the first job. Once you got the job, you did it at least as well as the men. So I told this afternoon the story about how Sandra Day O'Connor got her job. She was very high in her class at Stanford Law School. No firm in California would offer her a job as a lawyer. So she volunteered to work without pay for a county attorney for 4 months. And she said, at the end of that time, if you think I'm worth it, you can put me on the payroll. So that's how she got her first job.
I take it she was worth it.
More than that. But in my case, after the 2-year clerkship, my judge was able to tell prospective employers, she's here whenever I need her, even on a Sunday. So the second job was not the same obstacle as getting your foot in the door.
I want to spend a few minutes now on that remarkable time in your career when you were handling cases, arguing cases before the Supreme Court. It's that period of your career on which the biopic on the basis of sex is based. And have you seen that movie?
My nephew wrote the script. And I asked him, Daniel Stiepelman is his name, why did you pick that particular case? The case was Moritz against Commissioner of Internal Revenue. I said, I argued 6 cases in the Supreme Court. Why didn't you pick one of those? And Dan's answer was, I wanted the film to be as much the story of a marriage as the story of the development of a legal theory. What Charles E. Moritz's case was, there was, in those days, an income tax deduction for a person who had a young child in her care or an elderly parent. In Moritz's case, it was his mother. He took good care of her, though she was 93. He took the deduction, and it was disallowed because the deduction was available to any woman or any married or divorced man. Charles E. Moritz was a never married man. He represented himself in the tax court, and his brief was the soul of simplicity. It said, if I were a dutiful daughter taking care of my mother, I would get this deduction. I'm a dutiful son. It should make no difference. So that was the Moritz case.
Well, so your nephew wrote into that movie a very sexy scene of you and Marty. Do you have any comment?
My comment is Marty would have loved it.
even though he wanted to focus on this tax court case, let's spend a few minutes about the cases before the Supreme Court. How about the first one? Can you talk about the first case that you argued before?
Well, the first case that I briefed was Reed v. Reed, which was a turning point case.
Yes.
Sally Reed was a woman from Boise, Idaho. She had a son. She and her husband divorced. And when the child was what the law calls of tender years, she was awarded custody of the boy. When the boy reached his teens, his father went to the family court judge and said, now he needs to be prepared to live in a man's world, so I should be the custodian. Sally fought that because she thought the boy would not fare well in his father's home. Sadly, she was right. The boy was in a deep depression, and one day he took out one of his father's many guns and committed suicide. So Sally wanted to be appointed administrator of his estate, not for economic reasons. There was very little there. There was a small bank account. There was a record collection, his guitar. That was about it. But it was for sentimental reasons that she wanted to be in control of his possessions. The boy's father applied a couple of weeks later, and the probate court judge said to Sally, I'm sorry, but the law gives me no choice. It reads, as between persons equally entitled to administer a decedent's estate, males must be preferred to females. So it was the perfect case to get the Supreme Court to recognize that the laws differentiating between men and women did not operate benignly in women's favor. And it was a unanimous judgment. So after that, realizing it was the first time in history that the court ever found a gender-based classification unconstitutional, we thought we were on a roll. So the first case I actually argued was in 1973. It was Frontiero against Richardson. Sharon Frontiero was a lieutenant in the Air Force. When she married, she applied for that housing allowance that she thought was available to officers in the military. And she sought access for her husband to the medical and dental facilities on the base. She was told, these benefits are not available to female officers, only to male officers, because the assumption was if a man married, his wife was a dependent. But if a woman married, her husband was not dependent on her. In fact, her husband he was a college student, but that didn't make any difference. It was part of dozens and dozens of laws, state and federal, that divided the world into separate spheres. So the man was the breadwinner, and the woman took care of the home and the children. And if someone didn't stick to that proper role, they would be disadvantaged, just as Charles E. Morris was disadvantaged because he took care of his mother and he wasn't a daughter. And Sharon Frontiero, she couldn't believe this when she was told that essentially she would not get the same pay as a male officer because the housing allowance was worth money, as was free access to medical and dental facilities. So she started a lawsuit that ended up in the Supreme Court. And again, she prevailed. There was one dissent. It was by my later chief, then Justice Rehnquist.
You were on a roll. You argued 6 cases and won 5 of them.
Yes.
What made you such an effective oral advocate?
I suppose I was doing what my mother thought I ought to do, being a teacher. That is, I was facing a bench of men who thought they were very good husbands and very good fathers, and all the differentials in the law between men and women, they thought, favored women. For example, women were not called for jury duty. The court said, women should not be obliged to serve on juries, though men are, because women are the center of home and family life. But what is said to the woman as a citizen is you are expendable. We don't excuse men from serving on juries. We need them to help administer the system of justice. But we don't really need the women. It was getting the court to understand that these differentials were no favors to women. That in fact, as Justice Brennan said so well, the pedestal on which women are thought to stand too often turns out to be a cage. And opening their eyes to that reality was the challenge. One of my efforts was to try to get them to think of what they would like the world to be for their daughters and granddaughters.
You were an effective writer, still are, very effective writer. We Meredith English majors would like to know to whom or to what do you give the credit for your good writing?
To 2 of my professors at Cornell, one in the government department. I worked for Professor Robert E. Cushman, a great constitutional law scholar. And he pointed out to me that my writing was a bit on the flowery side. Then, an absolutely wonderful teacher of European literature was Vladimir Nabokov, famous for writing Lolita, among many other books. But this was a man whose first language was French, second Russian. English was his third language. And his lectures, I can remember them to this day. He explained why he preferred English. One example he gave, he said, suppose you want to say the white horse. Well, if you say it in French, it will be le cheval blanc. But you see cheval, you see the horse, and it's brown. So you have to change your image when you get to the white. But in English, the adjective comes first, the white horse. So you're prepared already for that. He was a man who was in love with the sound of words. And he would read, in the very first class, he read the opening of Bleak House, of Dickens' Bleak House.
I want to ask one more question about the time when you were arguing these cases before the Supreme Court. Tell us when and how the phrase for your analysis changed from sex discrimination to gender discrimination.
The use of gender in lieu of sex, for me, was attributable to my then secretary at Columbia Law School. she said to me, I'm typing these briefs and articles, and the word sex is jutting out all over the page. Don't you know that the first association of that word to the men you are addressing is not what you want them to be thinking about? So she suggested, use gender. It's a grammar book term. It will ward off distracting associations.
Maybe so. So let's turn now to your time on the court, and first with your nomination and confirmation. You know, by today's standards, you had rather a cakewalk for the confirmation process. Do you think it would have happened that way today?
Well, first, I should say how it did happen. I was nominated on June 14, and I was confirmed by the Senate on August 3rd. That was record time.
Record time.
There were only 3 negative votes. One of them was from the North Carolina Senate.
We're sorry, Justice Ginsburg.
But even Senator Helms didn't hold me up. Any senator could have put a hold on my nomination, which would have meant that the hearing would be held in September rather than in July. And a colleague of mine on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit from North Carolina, David Santel, came to my chambers at the Court of Appeals, gave me a big bear hug, and said, Ruth, Jesse's not going to vote for you, but he's not going to hold you up. So that was a triumph. Is it that way today? No, and the fault is on both sides. When you think of my current Chief Justice Roberts, superbly qualified, he had many negative votes. Or more recently, my dear colleagues, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, they should have gone through unanimously, but they had over 30 negative votes. I hope I will live to see the day when we go back to the way it was and the way it should be. And people
Justice Ginsburg, you write a fair number of dissents, a fair number of dissenting opinions, and I think your dissents help explain somehow why you are on coffee mugs and T-shirts and their action figures. We all have them. Tell us your philosophy about the importance of a dissenting opinion and when you decide to read a dissenting opinion from the bench.
Most dissenting opinions are noted but not read from the bench. The author of the majority opinion will say, Justice so-and-so filed a dissenting opinion. But if you think that your colleagues were not simply wrong, but egregiously so, then you make that known by reading a summary of your dissent from the bench, which I did in the Shelby County case. It was a case that was a challenge to the key provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, an act that Congress had renewed periodically with large majorities among Republicans as well as Democrats. But the court said that law was passed in 1965, and it worked this way. If you had been a city, a county, a state that suppressed African American voters, then you could not make any change in your voting laws unless you pre-cleared the change with the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, or with a 3-judge federal district court in the District of Columbia. That check kept the states in line because they knew if they passed a discriminatory measure, it wouldn't be pre-cleared. Say, if they shortened the hours that one could vote, or they put the polling places at locations that would be inconvenient to African American voters. The law also had a built-in way out, and it was that if a state or city or county had a clean record for X number of years, it could bail out. It could come out from under the pre-clearance system. But the court decided that that formula to determine what jurisdictions had discriminated was outdated. It was 1965, and we were already in the 21st century. So the court said it's unconstitutional. Congress can do it again based on contemporary conditions, but they can't rely on the way things were in 1965. Well, think about it. What member of Congress, what representative, or what senator would stand up and say, my state is still discriminating against African American voters, so keep us under the pre-clearance system? No one would do that. So there was a student at New York University Law School who thought that that decision was very wrong. And at first she was angry. But as I said, anger is not a useful emotion. So she said, I'm going to do something positive about this. And she created a blog, the notorious RBG. And then it took off into the wild blue yonder from there.
You had a famous friendship with Justice Scalia, your wonderful friend Nino. And he wrote pretty scathing dissents to some of your opinions. I believe in the VMI case that you talked about with the students earlier today, Justice Scalia had written a scathing dissent. 2 questions. Why did he do that? Why was he so acerbic in his opinions? And 2, how did you maintain your beautiful friendship in spite of it?
Why did he have such a, jazzy or style? Yes, it was a scathing dissent, but he gave me a copy of his dissent before he was ready to circulate it to the court. He came into my chambers and said, Ruth, I'm not ready to circulate yet. I want to make some changes, but I want to give you as much time as I can to answer. And I certainly appreciated that. I mean, as it turned out, he was indeed wrong, because VMI is flourishing today, He thought that admission of women would spell the end of the school, but it surely didn't. I visited VMI at the 21st anniversary of the decision. The head of the school was so proud of the women cadets. The faculty was elated because VMI was able to upgrade its applicant pool by including women. Some people remarked about the VMI case, well, what woman would want to go to such a school? And I said, well, I wouldn't, and probably you wouldn't. But there are many women who want to go to VMI and are prepared for the rigors of that education. And they should not be denied an opportunity that they are ready, willing, and able to grasp.
We should probably clarify, because in that opinion, you wrote for the majority that the all-male admissions policy was unconstitutional. That was a public school, very different from Meredith College, and it's all female.
Yes, and in fact, the name of the case is United States against Virginia, because it was the federal government suing the state of Virginia for making an opportunity available to men that was not available to women.
You mentioned a few minutes ago your sisters-in-law, Justices Kagan and Sotomayor. How important is it that there are now 3 of you on the bench?
It's tremendously important to the public perception of the court. The worst time for me was when Justice O'Connor retired and I was the lone woman. People come to the court to watch proceedings. We have school children on a 10-minute line coming in and out of the court, and the image that they got, they saw 8 rather well-fed men and this rather small woman. But now that we're 3, we're all over the bench because of my tenure is so long, 26 years. I sit next to the chief. Sotomayor is on one side of me at the end of the bench and Kagan on the other. So we're 1/3 of the bench. We look like we're there to stay, no longer one-at-a-time curiosities. And anyone who's watched proceedings will have observed that my sisters-in-law are not shrinking violets. They take a very active part in the colloquy that goes on at oral argument.
And they don't confuse you anymore,
Oh,
do they?
yes. When I was a new justice, invariably, 4 or 5 times a year, one lawyer or another would respond to my question, Justice O'Connor. And she would say, I'm Justice O'Connor. She's Justice Ginsburg. They knew there was a woman on the Supreme Court, and although we don't look alike, and we don't talk alike, they heard a woman's voice, oh, it had to be Justice O'Connor. And one professor of linguistics tried to come to our aid, and it was on a day when Justice O'Connor was asking a question, and then I asked a question, and she said, just a minute, I'm not finished. There was a headline in USA Today. Rude Ruth interrupts Sandra. So when I was asked to comment on that, I said, well, the guys do it to each other all the time. And you never made a fuss about that. So the reporter, to his credit, watched proceedings for the month, and he said, you know, you're right. They do interrupt each other all the time. But I didn't notice it until it was two women. Then this linguist explained that Justice O'Connor was the girl of the Golden West. She grew up on a ranch in Arizona. And I was a Jewish girl born and bred in Brooklyn. Jews tend to talk fast. Cowgirls talk slow. But in fact, people who knew us recognized at once that Sandra got out 2 words to my every one. It's another example of the stereotype at work.
We've acknowledged that confirmation hearings for Supreme Court justices are rancorous. You are, I'd say, a glass half full, or perhaps even a glass is always overflowing kind of person, and you remain optimistic about the court. Share with us why you are.
Perhaps it would be helpful to say something about the comic opera Scalia Ginsburg in that respect. The opera was written by a young man who was a music major at Harvard, then got a master's in music at Yale, and then decided that in his line of business, it might be helpful to know a little about the law. So he enrolled in his local law school, University of Maryland. He was from Baltimore. And he's taking a constitutional law class. And he reads these dueling opinions. Scalia for the court, Ginsburg in dissent, Ginsburg for the court, Scalia. And decides that this will make a very funny opera. So it begins with setting up our different approaches to constitutional interpretation. Scalia opens with a rage aria. For those who are in the music business, is very Handelian in character. It goes like this. The justices are blind. How can they possibly spout this? The Constitution says absolutely nothing about this. And then in my lovely coloratura of voice, I respond, dear Justice Scalia, you are searching for bright line solutions to problems that don't have easy answers. But the great thing about our Constitution is that, like our society, it can evolve. The plot is roughly based on Mozart's The Magic Flute. Scalia is locked in a dark room. He's being punished for excessive dissenting. And then I enter through a glass ceiling. And I'm going to help Justice Scalia pass the tests he needs to pass to get out of the dark room. Then a character left over from Don Giovanni, who's called the commentatore, is astonished. He said, why should you want to help him? He's your enemy. And then we sing a lovely duet. I say, he's not my enemy, he's my dear friend. The duet goes, we are different, we are one. Different in our approach to reading legal texts, but one in our reverence for the Constitution and for the institution we serve. And I think that's true of every justice. Every justice wants the court to be in as good shape when that justice leaves as it was when the justice entered. And to do that, we have to be collegial. And collegiality really matters in our workplace.
Justice Ginsburg, I'll close by asking you to give us a little glimpse of your session with the Meredith students. I hear you whisk everybody out of the room except the Meredith students. And then they...
I didn't, the Meredith faculty did.
All right. Good for you, Meredith. They ask for your advice. What advice did you give
What
them?
I told them is, whatever field you choose to pursue, in addition, do something that is outside yourself, something that will make things better in your community for people less fortunate than you are, things that will bring people together instead of dividing them. And I told the students that in my long life, I have gotten enormous satisfaction from things I was not paid to do. So I think if you're a caring member of a community, then you will want to work for the betterment of that community. So whatever is your passion, whether it's what you're worried about, climate change or the remaining discrimination, do something that will help repair the tears in your community.
Well, everyone, on behalf of a very grateful college, nation, and world, thank you for what you have done, Justice Ginsburg.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good job.